That's the thing.
She's able to change the slides. Okay.
I will just take a quick picture for the camera.
Before you go.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone, I'll go ahead and start. Welcome to week 6 ESE seminar series. It's my great pleasure to introduce Ainhoa Campos Posada, who is our Spanish fellow here at the center this year. She's the Ramón visiting fellow. She's a specialist on the civilian experiences of the Spanish Civil War. She got her PhD at the Universidad Complutense in Madrid in 2018. She published a series of articles, published a book in English, The Supply Question of Total War, Madrid during the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939. She's also published a book in Spanish, In the Search for a Very Past, the graves of the Francoists in Castilla. So today we're going to hear about her talk on food for Spain. She'll be followed then by Tom Buchanan. We're very, very pleased you're here. You're perfectly ideal, really, as a respondent. Tom is professor of history here at Oxford, based at Kellogg. Has published a range of books, including 3 on Spanish-British relations, Spanish Civil War and the British labor movement back in 1991, Spain, Britain and the Spanish Civil War in 1997, and then his book on impact of the Civil War in Britain, War, Loss, and Memory. So the memory issue, I think, will be one that connects both of you. Tom has also attest to his range. He's written a book on the relation in Britain and the British left and China called East Wind. And his latest book was Amnesty International and Human Rights Activism. So he's actually a perfect person to help situate some work in a broader context. So without further ado, the talk of the tonight is Food for Spain, Propaganda, Civil Society, and Humanitarian Debate in Oxford during the Spanish Civil War. So welcome.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you for chairing the session too. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. It is a pleasure to me to be here in what I consider now my home away from home, as Professor Timothy Gardner says. And I would also like to thank Alpha, Julie, and Walid for organizing this. Tom for agreeing to be in my discussant, because I know I'm going to learn a lot from what he needs to say. And I want to thank my friends from High Tables and other social spaces I've been meeting these past months, because I've talked to them endlessly about this project, and yet they are here again to hear me talk about it. However, this talk today is going to be a little bit more organized. As you can see on the screen, I have divided my talk into 6 parts to try to give a broad picture of the research I've been carrying on here on how Oxford citizens and students reacted to the Spanish Civil War, with a particular focus on how they perceive the relief schemes that were developed to help Republican Spain and the debates these initiatives generated. And I think that the first question I need to answer is, why food? The Spanish Civil War was one of the examples of a modern total war because it involved the entire population, economy, and infrastructure. Both the Republicans and the rebels diverted all available resources to their war effort, involving not only soldiers but also civilians in production and propaganda, while cities, industries, and farmland became battlegrounds. As a result, civilians were not only caught in the crossfire, but they were deliberately targeted. If the home front was as important as the battlefront, if butter was as important as guns, then demoralizing, bounding, and injuring civilians was a military objective. One of the most spectacular ways of targeting them was the bombing of cities, but food was also weaponized, and it was weaponized to inflict damage on the home front. The Republic had a more difficult starting point in this context. The military uprising of the 18th of July 1936 achieved a quick victory in a third of Spain, as you can see in the map in the blue part, mainly in the agricultural areas that had been conservative strongholds in the election of February 1936. Apart from Seville, the major cities remained loyal to the Republic, and that was also true for the industrial regions such as Asturias, Catalonia, and País Vasco. Money reserves also remained with the Republican government. There was also a larger population living in the loyalist territory than in the rebel territory. Some authors suggested that this all meant that the Republic had a significant advantage at the start of the war. They had more money, more population, and the industries. But was this the real story? Was this an advantage? These authors didn't pay attention that all these things in the context of a long war, of a total war, were a disadvantage. Why? Because the Republic had millions of mouths to be fed, and it lacked the resources to feed them. Because of the non-intervention pact, money had to be spent on buying weapons. And the supply problem ended up being one of the biggest problems of the Republic during the war. It started early, and it only got worse as long as the war developed. Because as you can see on the following maps, the Republic kept on losing territory, kept on losing agricultural areas, but it kept the main city until the end of the war. What was traditionally seen as an advantage, it was the opposite, a disadvantage, and this was known by both the Republics and the rebels. While the rebels tried to make the problem worse by sabotaging the supply lines, spreading discontent among civilians, and used all of this to discredit the Republic internationally, the Republic did its best to keep the supply lines open, to manage discontent, and to get help from other countries. This war on food and propaganda was fought internationally, and that's what I came here to study. British attitudes during the Spanish Civil War were complex, reflecting a range of ideological positions and responses to conflict, which I will try to summarize here in a non-exhaustive way. The conservative government pursued a policy of non-intervention with the aim of containing the war and preventing either side from acquiring weapons. This policy ended up proving beneficial to the rebels, who received more help from Germany and Italy than the Republic received from the Soviet Union. The pro-Franco section of the right, which was largely sympathetic to Hitler and Mussolini, was quite happy with the situation because it was clear that it was helping the rebels. This included the British fascists. It's out there. The bulk of the Conservative Party was made up of supporters of non-intervention, which also did not care too much about the Spanish Civil War, or about the fate of Spain, in fact. There was a smaller section of the right that saw the dangers posed by the Axis powers, but was constrained by anti-communism and a number of tactical considerations. On the left, the Labour Party, while initially advocating non-intervention, had factions that were sympathetic to the Republic, to the Spanish Republic. Many Labour members and affiliated trade unions organized to support the Republicans, seeing the conflict as a struggle between fascism and democracy. These people organized in many ways to try to help Republican Spain. And why should we study this question in Oxford? This is the next question I'm going to answer. Well, the first thing is that local examples provide depth and context, showing how local dynamics reflect and reinforce wider historical trends. Let me go back if you want to stop. If not, we can stay here. And Oxford, it's also a very interesting example because it's a unique blend of town and gown. It creates a dynamic environment where academic and local life had been intertwined for centuries. Oxford also showed a high degree of political awareness in the 1930s, thanks in part to the growing influence of the workers of the Morris factories and the Oxford University Press. And being completely honest, it was also convenient for me to focus on Oxford responses to the Spanish Civil War because here I have access to the archives and the periodicals that were created at the time. But I was also fascinated with the story of this town when I started living here a few months ago, and I wanted to learn more about it. Most importantly, the Spanish Civil War left its mark in Oxford. Of the 2,500 British and Irishmen that joined the international brigades, 31 were from Oxford. The Oxford Communist Party was more active than the average local party. Many platforms were set up and operated here in Oxford to help Republican Spain. And the political leanings of the people involved, students and Oxford citizens, were very broad, including prominent conservatives as Edward Hill. At the same time, Oxford was also the heart of the few openly pro-Franco campaigns, led some of them, or many of them, but by Francis de Zulueta, which was a professor of civil law at All Souls, and home to the active but decaying Oxford branch of the British Fascist Union. The conservative tendency of many students, especially in the more prominent polities, also makes this city a fascinating place to study reactions to the Spanish Civil War. But the most intense mobilization took place between the supporters of the Republic and those who, regardless of ideologies, concentrated their efforts on helping their citizens. And that's what we're going to focus on. The press shows that the Spanish Civil War was a preoccupation of Oxford since the beginning of the war. And now we're going to the press. The attention was continued during the whole conflict, but the periods of interest were different depending on what was happening in Spain, and this coincided with the national trends here in the UK. The Oxford Mail, one of the city newspapers, was decidedly pro-Republican, frequently criticizing the non-intervention agreement and devoting a considerable number of articles to the plight of its citizens, welcoming all the 8 programs as the only way that the British citizens have left to help Republican Spain. Of the students' papers, the Oxford Forward was the most progressive of them and therefore the most active on the Spanish question, stating that in the case of this conflict, food and freedom were inseparable, and that the only way to help Spanish democracy was to send food, because they considered that the only way Franco could win this war was starving the Republican citizens. The Oxford Guardian, which was the journal of the Liberal Club, was also very bellicose, and the Cherwell, which at first did not pay much attention to the conflict, ended up supporting the Republican side. Its rival, the Areces, was much more conservative and paid less attention to the issue, while the university's own journal, the Oxford Magazine, didn't even mention the conflict during the first months it started. This reinforces the idea that it was the leftist section of the undergraduates that started to worry about the Spanish Civil War earlier and mobilized more than the conservative undergraduates and their professors, who took more time to react. And when they did, most of them used the prism of humanitarianism to justify their actions. It was through this prism that Oxford City Hall established the mayor of Oxford Spanish Relief Fund on the 11th of December 1936, pretty early in the war. Its name stated that the fund was for non-combatants, and its many advertisements always reminded people that matters of political or religious opinion had no place in it. The fund undertook a wide range of activities, including the sale of stamps, a house-to-house collection, or the organization of fundraising events. And it worked with members of the university in many of these. When Mayor Eldon, the one you have on the screen, died in a car accident in the summer of 1937, because traffic has always been a major problem in Oxford, as I can see, the successor agreed to carry on. Students and citizens worked together in many other schemes with different aims and political leanings. a peace talk organized by the Oxford and Council of Peace Council, focusing its attention on helping Republican Spain. There was also the People's Bookshop of Communist Living, which housed the Left Book Club, selling and discussing books on the Spanish Civil War and working as a collection point for food and other important things. Students were both part of the staff of these shops and also customers. Mortgage workers, Oxford students, and local labor and communist activists worked together to send medical supplies to Spain from the beginning of the war. Fundraising events were often celebrated. The town hall, the Carfax Assembly Hall, the colleges were spaces that were set aside for well-known speakers that came here to raise awareness. Members of the university and the political parties joined these groups and joined groups that visited Spain, precisely Republican Spain, to combat and share their opinions with the public. Pacifists, belligerent leftists, and also conservatives joined forces together to help Republican Spain. Sending food in this situation could be seen as a purely humanitarian thing or as a political stance. We will come back to this later. The help provided to the refugee Basque children was also another example of mobilization that involved both town and gown. On the 23rd of May, 1937, almost 4,000 Basque children refugees fled the war and arrived to Southampton. A Basque children's committee was forced to take responsibility for their care because the government insisted that the Basque refugees should be maintained by this committee, by the people. There were 4 colonies in Oxfordshire, and fundraising events, community gatherings, educational campaigns were organized very frequently to help the children. Members of the university were very involved in this task. This was especially important in a time in which students had to seek permission from the proctors for many public activities. As you can see in the letter, and this letter that was written to the junior proctor in January 1939, a member of the labor club asked for permission to take part in a house-to-house collection of food. And permission had to be sought many times more as the students became more and more politically involved in the affairs of town. As you can see in the next letter, in this case, a group of students asked for permission to take part in the May Day demonstration of 1938. And although they were not allowed to carry banners, they found more creative ways to protest against the non-intervention pact. This group of students chained themselves together and marched alongside a representation of Spanish mothers and children that had a slogan that read, "Born to be cannon fodder," and it can be partially seen at the side of the picture. In this other protest, the students used masks representing the dictators of Europe at that time, in this case, Hitler masks. And this picture found its way to the proctor's desk. That's where I found it. So it caught its attention. Another time in which members of the university participated in town politics was the by-election of 1938, held to fill the vacancy left by the death of the conservative MP of Oxford. The Spanish Civil War had a profound impact on the political strategies of the parties involved. The candidates were Quintin Hogg, a conservative and a strong supporter of Chamberlain, and Alexander Lindsay, a master of Balliol College, an independent candidate, and that was supported by both the Labour and the Liberal Party, and an opponent to the appeasement policy. This by-election took place a month after the Munich crisis of September 1938 and was fought almost entirely on appeasement. Local issues were barely mentioned during this election, which was very unusual. The members of the university worked intensely for Lindsay's campaign. Hogg won, but his majority was halved, and there was a significant increase in the turnout. Raymond Carr, which later was warden of St. Antony's, was in fact part of this campaign, and he worked with Somerville undergraduate, delivering leaflets in summertime. Now that Somerville is being mentioned, I can go to the next topic, If we pay close attention to these activities, and in particular to those related to food, we find a protagonist: women. Women were then a minority in the University of Oxford, a minority that had only recently come into being and still didn't have the same rights as the male students. They attended the four women-only colleges: Somerville, Lady Margaret Hall, St. Hilda, and the Society of Oxford Home Students, which back then wasn't, but was going to be later on, St. Anne's College. Nevertheless, they were only present in the mobilization to help Republican Spain. When the Majors Relief Fund began its work, it joined forces with Somerville College, which began holding knitting parties to make winter clothes for Spanish citizens. Soon, the rest of the women colleges joined in, to the point that in St. Hugh, this was considered a proper epidemic. Later on, women colleges were keen to adopt Basque children, with the Somerville correspondent having to deny the rumors that the kid would actually live in college. Other original schemes involved the selling of hot chocolate or inviting renowned speakers to talk about Spain. On the contrary, many colleges participated less or gave less publicity to this participation, and when they joined in, they used different words to describe this. They would usually speak about supporting a child, but not adopting them. Adopting is a word used by women colleges. What were women doing here? Why would they participate more in these relief-related projects? Well, non-political or conservative women could help with the provision of food and clothing because it was within their feminine sphere and generally understood as non-political or non-partisan. Women were expected to take a lead role in the caring of their families, but also in that of the society as a whole. They were also not expected to participate in politics because it was commonly understood that they weren't ready for that activity or they participated in it for all the wrong reasons. I guess in the middle of the screen, you can find a poem called The Undergraduate, a satirical poem about women students that stated that their participation in politics was only owed to their aim of finding love and excitement. And it says, I'm sorry because I need to read it. In politics, I know no left from right, but join the Labour Club because I might find red and revolutionary romance in the strong grip of comrades or Golange. Their presence at the university was strongly criticized, but some like Gerald Dickin, which is another article on the screen, blame on them the decadence of Oxford. So, for those women who wanted to be more involved in the community, participating in the Spanish relief schemes could also be a way that they could feel that they were making change in their environment, but they were doing it in a safer way, in a way that wouldn't damage their reputation or expose them to hard critics. For women who were really passionate about politics and saw it, all these initiatives allowed them to give the best of themselves in a sphere that they also understood to be properly theirs. One of the last pictures of the slide was written by a woman involved in politics, in left-wing politics, in fact, who congratulated herself on taking part in welcoming the hunger marchers to Oxford, because her male colleagues didn't think properly about their feeding, about how they were going to take care of the hunger marchers when they got to Oxford. And she thought that political parties needed women precisely to make up for this lack of thinking in men. The article above it says that although the Somerville students wanted to follow the example of men's colleges, have a bread and cheese dinner to send the savings to the UK's deprived areas, they couldn't because their parents needed to agree first. And they say, we can't start without permission. That was their conclusion. They were treated differently than their men counterparts. In this context, in the last weeks of the Spanish Civil War, the many schemes to help Spain continued in the women's colleges, even though they had begun to disappear in others, the main ones. Women chose to participate more in relief work because it was expected of their gender and because it was seen as non-political. But if you will allow me to come back to the previous slide and focus our attention on the piece on the epidemic at St. Hughes and the knitting fever piece, you will see that the correspondent said that the symptoms of this disease were strange and of a uniform red color, pointing out that its outbreaks are almost entirely confined to those whose ideologies are tinged with the same color. So, was it political or not? That was one of the main debates in Oxford, down and down, about the humanitarian aid sent to Republican Spain. There were many, and I'm going to focus just on the most important ones. Going back to the main question, was it political? Which, by the way, was related to another one. Should it be? Should it be political? I want to take you back to Somerville again. On the 24th of February 1937, the Labour Club organized a meeting in Spain on the condition imposed by the chair that there should not be a mention of politics. The meeting was a great success, however, because it triggered another episode of knitting fever. So, as we can see, there were many players involved in this that thought that chairing and assisting a meeting in Spain and obviously knitting clothes for the Republican citizens could be absolutely separated from the political sphere. A true political manifesto outwrites many during these years. In February 1937, the Oxford University Spanish Democrats Defense Committee, and I think this is the last time I have to read this name completely, issued an appeal for money to send an ambulance to Spain. But the leaflet they created, and which I haven't been able to find, worded it in such a way that many felt they had to confirm that they agreed with the end, but not with means. The university proctors, who had received several complaints about the language used in the leaflets, wrote to Carrot, who was named as a member of this committee. The proctors objected that such a body was not registered with them, as political associations would be, and the activities permitted to such organizations did not, of course, extend to publicizing the public in this way. Carrot replied that although he had been a member of the committee, he had resigned in protest at the offending leaflet, so he was really angry at it. He nevertheless praised the work of the committee and called the event a childish folly. Other people didn't see it that way. Howard Biggs of the Oxford University Fascist Association saw this leaflet as one of the symptoms of the great communist drive he believed was taking place in Oxford. He claimed that the whole town was plastered with posters for the People's Bookshop, the Left Book Club, and there were weekly lectures on communism, and said that every student had received that leaflet that said, "War will come if fascism is allowed to win in Spain." Gibbs stated that indignation was widespread among the citizens of Oxford, among the dons of Oxford, and among the undergraduates. And he said that all these people wanted the propaganda to be stopped. In the end, he blamed an American Jew for organizing everything. On the opposite side, we find Ashley Bramall, secretary of the committee, that defended the idea that political campaigns had been more successful in getting aid for Spain than the purely humanitarian ones. He said that the body, in fact, was political, and the propaganda it was used for a purpose that was humanitarian in the end. So, in Bramall, future Labour politician, we have someone who thought that, of course, all these schemes were political, but they were rightly so. Again, this was not the widespread feeling. A retiring proctor lamented the increasing traffic of senior members of the university in the vulgar currency of party politics, while a collaborator with the ISIS complained that the undergraduates seem to forget that they come here to be educated and broaden their minds, as an opposite of participating in politics. This idea was shared by people in town. After a meeting in the town hall in June 1937, attended by the Duchess of Atholl, Gilbert Murray, and Professor Moreno, all of them sympathizers with the Republic, the Majors Relief Fund held a discussion on its continuation, it was decided that the fund will keep going on the condition that they would maintain this strictly non-political attitude. One of the members, Mrs. Michael, then left the fund. Was it because she felt that, despite these declarations, the fund was taking a political line? I can only speculate at the moment, but I'm quite sure that something happened at that meeting at the town hall, that made some people think that the fund was not keeping its non-political vows. Just to point out something else related to this question, the profound dislike of the involvement of students in politics was also born of the idea that this could disturb the relationships between town and gown. We don't have more time to go into this, which is a fascinating part. Let's move to the next question around these humanitarian debates. Could them be understood as a form of intervention? The conservatives were most keen to deny it. When the issue of accepting past children was raised, with some people claiming that taking these children was a way of relieving the Republic and thus helping to its war effort, Raven Ellis, a conservative MP, decided to refute this in a letter to the press. He said, "We do not favor either the government forces or the rebels in Spain," and stated that helping the past children was not a political issue, but a humanitarian one. Others did not seem to agree with this idea and thought that both taking the children and running the blockade to feed the starving population of Bilbao were ways of actually intervening in the war. They considered this helped the Republic to sustain the war effort and could end up blowing the non-intervention agreement. A pro-Franco colonel turned this idea around, saying that keeping the past children, in the end, when Bilbao had fallen, was going to help Franco. He said, "Franco and his staff now have fewer mouths to be fed," adding that if the people that were behind helping the past children here in the UK realized that, they would send the past children back to Spain as soon as possible. This debate had even broader implications. The Oxford Union Society frequently debated issues relating to the Spanish Civil War or British foreign policy at the moment, with a growing number of members joining the critics of the non-intervention agreement and affirming that it was necessary to stop the world's dictators, even if it meant entering a new war. This, of course, provoked another debate. The Oxford Union Society, in an earlier moment, famously refused to fight under any circumstances to for king and country, and people remember this polemical position. So when the House called for more intervention or said directly that some wars were justified, the inconsistencies with what had been defended before were exposed. Indeed, one of the Oxford Times journalists wondered why these admirable young men who tell us that they will not fight for king and country ran off to Spain and offered their lives to Spanish communism, and urged everyone to drop the ideologies for a time and try to get back to practical British politics, therefore implying that British politics were usually non-ideological. Another of these debates, one of the livelier ones, was about for how long would this aid be needed, and it was especially applied to the Basque children. On the 30th of April 1937, the Oxford Mail's editorial stated that the scheme of helping the Basque children would enable them to be domiciled here for as long as it's necessary. But other contributors to the paper weren't so sure about this. The writer of today's London Letter, a daily section of the same paper, warned that those who are organizing this movement should give some thought to the future, asking what will be the position of the children if Franco wins, and pointed to southern France as a more adequate destination for them. As early as the first days of July 1937, some people began to say it was time for the Basque children to return to Bilbao, now that the city had fallen into Franco's hands. This was how some conservative MPs expressed their opinions in the House of Commons. For others, this attitude was described as undignified haste and more proof of the lack of empathy or sympathy with the victims of fascism, as a reader of the Oxford Mail expressed in another letter. This person, who simply signed as sympathizer, thought that the Basque children had not a sort of a home, let alone a comfortable one, and thought that they should remain in Britain for as long as necessary. Again, as long as necessary. Just as sympathetic, another correspondent couldn't understand this previous position and said that the children were brought so they should not suffer from air deployment or in a long siege of Bilbao. Both these dangers are now past, so he considered that the Basque children could come back to Spain. As late as November 1938, the Oxford University Spanish Democrats Defense Committee was able to secure 3,000 signatures on a petition to allow the Basque children to remain, the Basque children that were still in Oxford. While some of the women colleges continued to support their adopted child after the end of the Spanish Civil War. In a broader sense, the Majors Fund continued to function as long as it was determined to kept on going, as long as there is still a need. Again, the problem was that not everyone had the same understanding of this phrase. But people didn't agree on even more basic things, such as whether the humanitarian effort would end up doing more harm than good. This debate intensified in the final months of the war when it became generally accepted that Franco would emerge victorious. In this context, if the Republic's defeat was inevitable, then sending arms to the Republic would only mean the prolongation of the war. As a member of Worcester College put in the Areces on May 1937. And since in a total war, civilians are as important as soldiers and food is as important as weapons, then sending food to Republican Spain would only prolong their suffering. For this writer in action, as a fascist magazine, Food for Spain was just an act of cruelty and a blunder. A major general sympathetic to the rebels even questioned this in a letter to the Times. He said, "Is it fair even to the people of the Republican territory to prolong this war by allowing arms, petrol, and food supplies to flow freely into what is really a beleaguered prison?" Of course, other people found this argument horrendous. The political commentator of the Teruel sarcastically suggested that the people who held this view were attempting to prove that Republican Spain is committing a crime against humanity in continuing to resist. If this debate was more prominent at the end of the war, there was one that accompanied the aid programs throughout the years of the conflict. And it was the question of whether the aid sent to Spain was distracting resources needed in the UK. A question summed up in this way: does charity begin at home? The very first schemes developed in Oxford, such as the house-to-house collection organized by the Majors Fund, were met with rejection by some people who claimed that there are plenty of good causes at home, or our own unemployed should come first. We can access these views not only through the complaints of the people involved in the schemes, but also because the people that complain about them wrote frequently to the press. A resident of Oxford considered that the United Kingdom was a country with people eagerly ready to fall over themselves to send money abroad, pointed to the fence as a place that really needed help, asking himself, where are our philanthropists now? Edwin Clegg, for his part, summed up the situation as money for the Spanish communists and chart breakers, money for the absconding Abyssinian refugees, in fact, money for anybody but a Britisher. The last letter started a long debate in the Oxford Mail. It lasted for weeks, between those who defended the relief initiatives and those who wanted the money to stay at home. As you can see in this image, the last one that appeared on the screen, 5 members of the public responded to Nick Clegg's claims in different ways. One stated that the relief funds were for non-combatants, others blamed the fascist states and parties for the role in the suffering British citizens were only trying to alleviate, while others stated that those who helped internationally were the ones that also helped national causes, and wonder if Setclet had ever contributed to any of them. Not related to Oxford, but good to illustrate this point, is this piece by the Blackster, mocking a letter in which a citizen asked for guidance as to which of a list of relief projects was more urgent, and to which he was answered that if he was to give his gift to have a political significance, there was no cause so urgent as feeding the population of government Spain. For the Blackster, it was offensive that neither of them had considered for 1 minute the destitute or unemployed of Great Britain. Some people just grew tired of these debates and propaganda and complained about, for example, the ubiquitous of omnipresent green labels that call for a boycott of German, Italian, and Japanese products, on the omnipresent Spanish activists, the all too frequent left-wing students, and so on. And I'm running out of time, so I need to go through this a bit faster. But students and citizens were tired of being surrounded by these issues all the time, and trying to go a bit faster to this part. They express their views, sometimes defacing posters. This is a picture of London, but this happened too in Oxford, as Honor Balfour complained about it in the Oxford Mail. And there were cases in which people that were, or institutions that were asked for help didn't refuse to offer their help, like the Aylesbury Council, who didn't give a house to house the Basque refugees, or Lord Nuffield, who was a known benefactor of Oxford, and at least not publicly helped the Republican Spain cause. Even the more mobilized people who were inclined to participate in the discussion of international affairs welcomed special occasions, such as the coronation of King George in 1937, as an opportunity to leave all the problems behind and just have a bit of fun. I see this as a symptom of how present these issues were and how concerned many citizens were about the impact of the foreign situation and the Spanish Civil War in the UK. There was a censorship polemic that's not strictly related to the food situation, so I'm sorry, I'm going to skip it to be on time. But newspapers here in Oxford were censored when a general said something about the Spanish Civil War, and the government didn't want the public to know what the general said. And I still don't know what the general said. I'm trying to find out. So, going to the conclusions of my work here. You can see that the humanitarian schemes developed in Oxford to help Republican Spain and the debates surrounding them reflected these broader tensions that existed before and had continued to shape global humanitarianism. Some of the questions explored in this presentation can be found in recent events and have profoundly affected British society and will probably be present in the future. The discourse around the Spanish Civil War in Oxford has continually wrestled with whether aid to Republican Spain should be an instrument of political intervention or could remain an independent moral imperative. The debate around this issue was very vivid, but those involved in it, or for or against, were frequently linked to a political view. This raises broader questions. Can aid ever be truly neutral, or can even the absence of aid of help be considered so? Also, despite their centrality, women's contributions were frequently framed within a paternalistic narrative that emphasized their roles as caregivers rather than decision makers. It is vital that we reassess women's contributions from new optics to fully understand its meaning. Focusing on the Spanish Civil War, it is clear that it is much more to be known about the event and about the international reaction it caused. Oxford's intellectuals and activists were deeply embedded in these battles, with the university serving as a battleground for competing interpretations of the conflict. One of the most important questions yet to be answered remains as to how all these debates were spurred by the Republic on one side or the rebels on the other. It is also one of the more elusive ones. I only hope that my research here will eventually shed some light to these questions and provide some answers to them. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thanks very much indeed. That was really interesting paper. You've done some great detective work, I think, in these Oxford archives. There's a lot there I didn't know. I was hearing for the first time, so that's really interesting. Also, having spent a year in the proctor's office as an assessor, I was grateful that times have changed. So I'm not having to track down these undergraduates for their what they're getting up to politics. So I suppose I can make some sort of more general comments and try and locate, as Paul was saying, try and locate what was happening in Oxford in a more general context. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that the impact of the Spanish Civil War in Britain was really quite profound. And I would say that in three ways. First of all, it was pretty well instantaneous. People respond to it very quickly. You have the first organizations actually sending aid to Spain within about a month, which was the Spanish medical aid campaign, and then obviously others followed. So it's instantaneous. It's very prolonged. You have passionate campaigning right down till the end of the Civil War, which is interesting because really it's clear the Republic's going to lose from quite a long way out. But in February 39, you have these very intense Arms for Spain demos around Britain, mainly in London, where they get so close to Parliament that they get viciously beaten up by the police. Also, given your food interest, they were meant to be called the Arms and Food for Spain, but they dropped the food bit because arms was what they needed. This is sounding quite contemporary as well, I think. Thirdly, very widespread. I mean, Oxford is an interesting, it's a pretty unusual case. It used to be thought this was something that really affected the industrial Britain. But the reality is that, really across Britain, you're likely to find people getting involved in civil. I remember finding a letter from Naomi Mitchison, the writer, who was living at that time up in Kintyre, which is quite remote. And she writes to, I think it's to Stafford Cripps, saying, as soon as the herring fishermen get home, I'm going to raise some money from the Barcelona. It's really, you don't have to be in an industrial city. So I think those three things are very important. We also know from the opinion polls that there was this very widespread support for the Spanish Republic. Now, the opinion polls are very unreliable. Really, the first ever opinion polls in Britain were taken on the Spanish Civil War. But they do show broadly a preponderance of support for the Republic, between 70 and 80%, about 7 or 8% for the nationalists. But they are unreliable because you have opinion polls taken at the same time. The question you're asking the public, would you rather go fascist or communist or something like that? It's kind of in its infancy. So we got this phenomenon of a lot of interest in the Spanish Civil War, people wanting to do something. Having said that, I think there's also an awful lot of people who don't do anything and are not interested. So we're talking really about people of a particular political orientation. What they want to do is to change government policy. And you mentioned non-intervention. That's the big thing. Early on, the government helped set up this non-intervention scheme, which is meant to prevent any state from sending weapons to Spain. Of course, we know that it was broken by the Germans, the Italians, and the Russians in particular. I think once people realise that government policy is not going to be changed, I mean, the national government had a massive majority in Parliament, that's when all these other things begin to happen. So in a sense, what they're doing is sort of filling the gap. If government won't do it, we will. It's what I would call a kind of DIY anti-fascism. All these things that you want governments to do, like whether it's sending arms or maybe even sending troops, sending food. If the government isn't going to do that, then you have to try and do it yourself. And so you have all these things like the Spanish medical aid, sending ambulances and medical aid. People send food ships, that is, they rent a ship and fill it full of food, generally sort of tin goods and that kind of thing. People recondition vehicles, and ultimately people will go and fight, and hence the international brigades, which is the kind of, they're there because the Red Army isn't there. That's the army that would have intervened, but obviously wasn't going to. So all of that's going on, and it's all going on under the banner of really the Popular Front, which I think perhaps I would have maybe drawn out a bit more. The Popular Frontism is the kind of umbrella for all of this, and it means that people can cross political boundaries, class boundaries, and religious boundaries in a way that is very powerful in the late 30s under this threat of war. Thinking in terms of perhaps ways also to develop what you're doing, I think there's a number of questions you might think about. I mean, one of them is, people talk about this 30s as being this very radical left-wing period, the Red Decade, that sort of thing. And yet, there's an awful lot of people at the time who are saying there's so much apathy around. I mean, it's quite remarkable, 1937, 38, people endlessly going on about apathy. And to our eyes, this looks pretty rich political mobilization. So there's a kind of tension there. But in a sense, not enough is being done. After all, we've got a conservative government with a massive majority, which is just sort of keeping everything under control. So I think I'd think about that context. Secondly, think about maybe a contrast with other university cities. I mean, obviously you couldn't compare to an industrial town, but clearly Cambridge would be a very interesting point of comparison. Maybe some of the other universities, like I would say something like Exeter, as it is now, it wasn't called that then, University College of the South and West, but they had a very strong peace movement, which was very involved in these sorts of campaigns. So think about those comparisons. I'd also say think about other campaigns in the 1930s. So these guys, the people you're showing, are very interested in Spain, but what about Abyssinia for that? What about Austria, which I know quite a lot of students got involved in during their vacations, maybe helping people escape and that kind of thing. And what about China would be the big one. I mean, certainly I found when I wrote the book that Paul mentioned about China and the British left, the university did run a campaign to try and replace the destroyed libraries of China. All the dons were being asked to donate their libraries to, send out to China. In fact, what the Chinese necessarily made of these libraries, I'm not sure. It wasn't recorded, sadly. But, I think there is that whole context of other things happening, which would be interesting to position your work alongside. And also, what do your people think about Spain? What do they know about it? Interest in Spain was kind of instantaneous in July 36, but also most people didn't know much about Spain. It was this kind of, unknown territory. Spain's been kind of out of the mainstream of European history for a long time. So, thinking about what they were reading, and whether there was room for kind of divergent ideas like anarchism, whether any anarchist undergraduates, surely you'd find some. And this whole thing of educating yourself, the 1930s was a great time of people really wanting to kind of maximize what they could learn about these events, like the Left Book Club, great example. The idea of mass political education. So I think that'd be good. And the final thing is think about the long-term effects of all of this, where it's all going. Clearly there is a radicalization going on. We know the Labour Club and the Communist Party and the student body were very strong in the 30s. At the same time, they do lose the election in 38. At the end of the day, okay, Quentin Hogg loses some voters, but compared to Bridgewater, where there's a similar by-election, where the Popular Front candidate does win. And also people talk about maybe the longer-term impacts. Some people say that kinds of things you've described contribute to Labour's victory in 1945 because of the kind of political mobilization that takes place. And certainly in my work, kind of found some great sort of long-term impact. So again, Paul mentioned I've written about the history of Amnesty International, and the guy who founded it, the barrister Peter Benenson. His first political activity was at Eton, where he ran the Eton College Spanish Republican solidarity campaign, and they adopted children, and he adopted a Basque child, not personally, but financially. And I interviewed him in 1997, and we were talking around things. And when I said I published a book on the Spanish Civil War, he immediately became very excited. He actually, that's it. That's where it all started. And I think he was meaning, okay, this idea of adopting, which in a sense like amnesty developed, adopting prisoners, but also I think you think about culturally, that's where it all began with the Spanish Civil War and this kind of expansion of political activism. So I think, I think there's many ways in which you could think about, developing it. But I mean, you obviously got some fantastic material there, so I wouldn't want to, put you off, focusing clearly on what you've got and maybe taking on board some of the things I've said to develop it.
Thank you. Hey, just wondering how we proceed. I'm going to just have a quick question in addition. So, I mean, one thing was interesting about the presentation, and Tom mentioned it in passing, is that this is a very, very secular story. You don't really talk at all about the role of churches, especially the Catholic Church, not just Catholic Church, but other churches that are involved in sending for charity. So if you could add that to your list. I think at this stage, given the fact we've got 30, 40 minutes or so, do you want to just pick and choose briefly some of the questions that Tom had given you and respond to those before we open up to everybody else? Or do you prefer we just open up now and you fold in those responses as you go?
I prefer to.
Okay, but just briefly, you don't have to answer all of them.
Yeah, no, well, thank you very much for all the ideas, because I didn't think about many of them. They are very interesting. I would love to have the time to compare with other university cities. That there's a very nice work on the comparison of British and French university reactions to the Spanish Civil War. And that has been like one of my main inspirations for this work. And I would love to do that, but probably won't have time, sadly. About how the Spanish Civil War had this profound impact very early in the war. That's completely true, and that has been like a lead. When I find a newspaper or magazine that doesn't mention the Spanish Civil War in the first months, I know that it's a purely conservative newspaper or magazine, or is not interested in politics, because all the other journals are mentioning it from the beginning. So that's what happened with the Oxford magazine, which was a university professors magazine. And in fact, I was reading it, I think, up to 1937, and it was 1937 when they started talking about these aid schemes to help. But before that, nothing. There were poems of Tolkien in the start of The Hobbit in the magazine, but not any mentions to the Spanish Civil War. That people kept on helping in the last months of the war, and that has been very fascinating too, because it was just the last weeks, and in some cases Barcelona had fallen, so it was just the south center part of Spain. It was very difficult for it to keep on working, keep on fighting, keep on resisting. I wonder how much, of course, this was a grassroots movement too, but how much this Republican propaganda of the Negrin government of we can still resist affected this programs. And that's one of the questions maybe I'm not going to find the answer, but I want to approach to it because I find it fascinating. And I think it had something to do that the means of propaganda of the Republican Spain were asserting that they could still win the war, and they were affecting the citizens' responses in that way. I love the concept of the DIY anti-fascism, and I'm keeping it, absolutely. I've been very interested in following these other relief schemes of other places that were affected by what many citizens and students thought as this war between democracy and fascism. And I've seen that the mobilization for China was spectacular too, and that some students were more struck by the Chinese example that from the Spanish one, which I didn't know. And some of them ended up crying after going to watch a documentary or a movie or a Chinese meeting, something like that. And I think that the boycott started with the Japanese, to the Japanese, and there were a lot of debates from the pacifist groups because they didn't know if they could join this boycott or not, because maybe that could mean the start of a bad state of mind of the British citizens against the Japanese, and they didn't want to create that. So yeah, well, fascinating debates that were generated by the help to China. And I haven't read that much about the case of Abyssinia, but of course, what happened to Austria was also very striking because it was set in the Munich crisis, and people that thought that could mean the start of another war, another war would start soon, were very interested on that, and they were helping all these academic refugees that came from Austria that not in that in those numbers, at least not at that time, came from Spain, because the exile from Spain was came later when the Spanish Civil War was over, and not during the war. So I think that here they had like a more profound impact of these academic exiles, refugees from these other countries. So it would be very interesting to compare it to these other cases, and Autumn wants me to introduce that point of view. I think he's right too. So I'll look into that. And I think that's all I can say for now. Thank you very much for every one of your comments. And Paul, the church question. Many Protestant groups were involved in these activities, not the Catholics, or not, at least not all of them. And there was a Catholic church that, in fact, started a collection to help Francoist Spain. In fact, because Catholics tended to be agreeing to agree with the Francoist side. But I need to look more into that. I know the Quakers played a big role helping Republican Spain too, but they were collaborating with these other all these other schemes. Like they had their own, but they were all together collaborating with the rest. But maybe Tom has more to say about this. But yeah, I need to incorporate this more or make it more visible too. Make it more visible.
Thank you very much. Let's start with Matt Carey in back, please.
Thanks very much, Ainhoa. Thanks, Tom, as well, for the comment. Great paper. I've learned a lot. I think, given you just also mentioned the Quakers, and this is more, I guess this aspect is more of a comment than a question. I wondered how far, and I'm phrasing it as a question, how far also this might feed through into, when we're talking about it feeding through into future initiatives, events, and things like that, into Oxfam, given the emphasis on humanitarianism and food and the Oxford dimension. So that I wonder if that might be something to pursue. But I wanted to push a bit further on something that Tom raised and something that I was thinking about, which is the idea of Spain, and where, you know, what the actual understanding or lack of knowledge is in the 1930s. So one of your letters from the chairwall, I saw the word I could just about make it out of. There was Dachau in there, but they're talking, you know, they're making, and then another one. There's a hierarchy of there was China that we were mentioning, Ethiopia, etc. And I just wondered, you know, particularly when it comes to food as well, what did they think? Did they think that Africa, you know, began at the Pyrenees? Is Spain kind of a desolate land of, you know, there is no food, and this is, you know, it's not just the war context. It's that it's not the breadbasket of Europe. It's I guess more of a basket case, you know, to use a metaphor. You know, are some people saying this is kind of, you know, this is a reasonably rich country in terms of, you know, agriculturally at least, and therefore this isn't something that we, you know, how far does it actually need food? Is it being used as a rhetorical tool? And I think linked to that, there's also that question of the hunger marches. You mentioned that how hunger is being used as a rhetorical tool, right? You know, we need to feed our own first, rather than feeding those who are abroad. But I just wondered if there was anything more to the relationship there, from a more, those are giving a more of a positive spin of thinking, okay, this is the 1950s being a decade of hunger. Is the relationship between what is happening in Britain in that regard and what is happening in Spain beyond simply using it as a tool to try and point out hypocrisy. It's kind of two questions merged into one there at the end.
Yeah, there's a few questions in that question. Do you want to?
Yeah, maybe
Okay.
I should answer first.
Yes, let's do that.
Yeah, let's move to the next one. So, for what I've seen for now is that some members of the initial Oxfam were related to these relief initiatives in the Spanish case. So I need to look further into that because it's very interesting. But it's always the same people, and that's the point of one of the letters, and I think it's very important. That one that complains about this person that says that we should help people here first. It's like, well, people that help internationally are the same that help national causes, and that happens with different causes. The people that participated in these projects, in these programs, later on, well, part of Oxfam or Amnesty International, all these other relief initiatives. So that's very interesting, and I hope I can trace the continuities of that. I don't know. I'm not sure if I can do it, but I will try. About the idea of Spain, this previous mindset that British people had about Spain, that's fascinating. Yes, because it wasn't seen as a purely civilized European country. In fact, in many cases, you can see letters here in Oxford of people saying, well, we are trying to help these savage people that they are killing themselves between themselves because they don't know better. And well, that's going to be widespread in a few years in the Second World War. But in that moment, they think that the Spanish Civil War is a very foreign case. Many people thought that. And that obviously has to do with this previous mindset. And that state of mind was probably behind all these other people trying to help Spain because they were not they were not only seeing the problem that the war caused, they had also this feeling of Spain being as an underdeveloped country. So I haven't thought it that way, but I think you're completely right. And linking it to what Tom said earlier, I should probably try to see how people thought of Spain here before the war started to try to make connections.
Great.
Let's come on that.
You wanna come? Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very important point that I mean, I think there's clearly a kind of performative aspect to all of this collection of food and that kind of thing. I mean, food less so. I mean, the potato marketing board gave a vast amount of misshapen potatoes, and you wouldn't send them to Spain unless people were going to eat them. You know, they're going to get there in one piece. People have a lot of tinned food and that kind of dried milk, so that was really useful. But clothes were being collected, and there's a very interesting correspondence from Sir Richard Rees, who was a friend of Orwell's, and he became a pacifist and worked for the Quakers, and he was filling these boats with clothes that we collected. He writes and says, look, these are totally worn out clothes, you know, you collected from poor areas. People are giving them, but they're actually of no value. But they say, no, carry on, because it makes them feel good, you know, and you know, you can show that you're doing something. So there is definitely a kind of element there. Yeah, you know, it's the politics of it. You seem to be doing something, even if it's not actually really valuable.
Good question. Let's start with Timothy Garnash.
Yeah, thanks for a really fascinating talk. One slightly frivolous comment and two suggestions/questions. Slightly frivolous comment. Anyone who knew Raymond Carr would, I think, guess why he chose to work with the undergraduate Somerville College rather than with any of the all-male colleges. Put that on the paper. Two suggestions/questions, both of which pick up on things Tom said. I don't think you could, I mean, your story about the founder of Amnesty International, what, 60 years later, 70 years later, it was the formative moment. I don't think you can overstate how this was the formative moment. A whole generation of pushing intellectuals. I mean, archetypically George Orwell, W.H. Auden, but many, many more. And actually, for my generation, Spain was a kind of shorthand, a synonym for engagement with a political cause in a foreign country. So, you know, I wrote in my journal in 1980, apropos the Solidarność movement in Spain, Poland is my Spain, right? It was a shorthand for us. So I think there's a really interesting question, why this particular conflict. Of all the other, actually much bigger ones that were going on at the time, became that formative moment. And the second thing is, Tom mentioned the Popular Front overcoming class divide. Now, in the Oxford of the 1930s, most students and academics hardly knew of the existence of the Oxford of the Cowley workers, the car workers, and vice versa. I mean, these worlds simply never met. Did you find evidence that this, as it were, catalyzed, so to speak, a popular front inside Oxford and overcoming a class divide inside Oxford itself?
Well, thank you for the first comment. I use it as an introduction to the women because at first, to the women topic, because at first when I read that piece of information, I didn't realize Somerville was a women college. And for me, it was like a metaphor of how hidden women were until.
I think Raymond did.
Yeah. So, and then to the first question, I don't have the answer. So sorry, why it was so important, so formative. Maybe it has to do with the sympathy part of the British population felt towards Spain before the war. I think I read something about that. So maybe Tom can answer this question better than me. And about how these projects, these programs helped these two separate worlds, the Morris workers and the students, start to know each other. I've seen some cases of collaboration between them. I don't know up to what point they were together at the same space, but doing this, turning some things into splints to send to Spain, there was collaboration between the undergraduates and between the Morris workers at the shops, at the bookshop or the display shop that was open at the 77 George Street, now Nando's here in Oxford. And there I think they were collaborating too. So I still need to find more information to know if they were really side by side at the same time, talking to each other, or they were collaborating with the same institution. In fact, it's still being into different spheres. So I think this started to break the divide. I don't really know if it lasted when the Spanish Civil War finished and the Second World War started, but I think that there was some mix between these two previously separated worlds.
Thank you very much. Thank you much. Very interesting. My question's been partly asked already and partly answered. I think it's worth repeating. And the question is, were the parallels between the events you described and the subsequent reaction here to the Greek Civil War and therefore the creation of Oxfam? Clearly there were, but I think it's worth repeating because it's a question that will spring naturally into many people's minds. So you might think a little more about exactly what those connections were and why Oxfam developed in the way it did, without obviously distracting from your main focus.
Yeah, no, I absolutely need to look into the Greek Civil War example. Autumn has repeatedly told me that it's a very important thing to look into, and I really think it is because it's the start of Oxfam. That's important not only for Oxfam but for the UK and the world. And I think that maybe some connection there is that there was sympathy to the Greeks too, as the sympathy that was created to the Spanish people. So maybe that's one of the reasons that the Greek Civil War started this very big program that lasts to today. So, but I need to look into that.
Well, I can follow up on this and then ask my question because we're dealing with two different contexts. The pre-war, pre-World War II, where these two ideologies were really kind of both popular but competitive with each other. But then, the defeat of Nazi, but also going to the opposite side, And I think it might be interesting to see this new kind of context to what degree those political arguments play as well. But Oxford, I think, started also even before the Greek Civil War, right? During the second, yeah, that's right. So it was during the actual war. My question, maybe Tom can answer this better, is there is this sensitivity in the UK regarding the Spanish Civil War. But after the war, does this completely evaporate when you're seeing that there is a dictatorship happening in Spain? Is there apathy towards that kind of authoritarian regime that is consolidating itself during, all these kind of decades?
Yeah, for what I know, many of these groups wanted to keep on helping Spain even when the war was over and Franco was the winner. And this phrase of "as long as it's necessary" was behind many of these relief schemes. So many people truly believe that they should keep on helping Spain, even if it was a Francoist state. But Franco made it very difficult because he had like a set of rules as to how he could receive this help and how it was going to be delivered to the population. And there was a body, Auxilio Social, a fascist of fascist origins, that had to be the one sending the food in some specific places in which people were indoctrinated, and there was always a frame of Jose Antonio, the founder of the fascist party in Spain, Falange, and people had to pray before getting the chance to eat. So there were so many things involved that many people and many projects that wanted to keep on helping Spain decided to not continue. So I think that was one of the reasons that this big sympathy felt towards the Spanish people didn't translate into the sending of more aid during the post-war time. I think maybe the sympathy translated into pushing, or at least saying that it was necessary to overthrow Franco, but that goes farther in time, and I'm not an expert. But I think the first thing is that it's one of the causes of this relief stopping or being less important when Franco won.
Before we go to the last two questions, I just want to return to something that Tim has suggested about the uniqueness of the Spanish Civil War. I'm just wondering, Tom, do you want to come in on that question?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I did another book on the Spanish Civil War. It came out in June. It's called Spain Mad.
Oh.
And the reason I called it that was that I found a secret police informer's report from inside a very large factory. And in September 36, this guy just writes, all my colleagues have gone Spain mad. And there is that sense of people losing a sense of perspective over Spain. And I mean, all of their free time was being devoted to doing things for Spain. So there's something there about this intensity about it that spoke to that generation. And when we think about why Spain was so powerful, now, I mean, basically my answer to that is really that Spain was a perfect storm. Everything came together. You had a war that went on for 3 years, whereas Abyssinia was all over in a few months, really. It was very close by. You could do something about it. It was ultimately, I mean, I've used this phrase before, it was the perfect sort of forum for direct action. Everyone could do something for Spain. It didn't matter. I mean, you could do it in your own home. You showed knitting circles. That was actually a very widespread activity, especially in the winter. People were freezing to death on the battlefield outside of Madrid. You could, go around to a neighborhood and collect tins of food. You could send, if you're an engineer, you could recondition vehicles and send them out. And ultimately, yeah, you could go and fight. But that's only the kind of tip of the iceberg. What we all remember is that people went and were killed. But it's that sense of a conflict where, the British government were saying we're not going to allow intervention, but they never stopped anyone from going. They vaguely threatened to. So it was this amazing opportunity for people to kind of do something and feel that they were involved in this wider struggle. And I don't think it's ever been repeated in that sense. So that's how I always think of it, try and conceptualize, what Spain presents as this amazing opportunity. And some people took it, and others obviously didn't.
Very helpful. Thank you. Jonathan.
Yeah, I would like to go back to the question about, what people knew about Spain, because even right up to the sort of 60s, the population of this country didn't really go to Spain for all sorts of reasons. And essentially what they knew about Spain was what they'd learned in history at school. And history was basically Philip II and the Spanish Armada, Columbus, and the Treaty of Utrecht and Gibraltar and so forth. So what intrigues me, or the question I would have is, why did people have sympathy for Spain? Because we'd all been taught at school that basically, Spain, insofar as it existed, and history was taught in schools and in the first half of the 20th century, right through the 60s, as basically British history. And it was only insofar as it impacted on this country that anything on the outside of the channel really mattered still. And so, why did, when all we knew about Spain was bad, because essentially it was fighting wars with them, why did people have sympathy? Was it politics? Was it the fact that you had an elected government? It was a red decade to an extent. Did that impact on the average person? Whatever was happening in Oxford at the rarefied level of the university, where people knew a bit more about these things. Why did ordinary people suddenly react to that? Because they really didn't know anything but bad things about Spain. And you heard Chamberlain about Czechoslovakia, faraway country of which we know little. And Spain was not perhaps quite as far, but we didn't know much about it.
Yeah. Well, I think that part of the answer to the question is that most people didn't really care about Spain. And it was just a minority, a very important minority that mobilized to help Republican Spain. So for many British citizens, it was just this faraway war, which doesn't affect us, and that we don't want it to affect us anymore than it's already doing. And I think that we can see that in how some people reacted to this overwhelming propaganda and initiatives everywhere. Like, please leave us alone in peace for once, because you are always talking about the Spanish Civil War. We don't care. And it was linked to this view of the Spanish as these savages that were underdeveloped, and they were fighting and killing each other because they weren't apt for democracy and as civil society rules. So I think that's part of the answer, that it was a fragment of society that really care about Spain. Maybe they were better informed, or they were politically informed because they were linked to party politics, and then they had the information these parties were sending to their militants. So maybe that's part of the answer. And then thinking about this example about history books, that's the main source of information about our country for the majority of people. That happened in Spain too. Most people only knew about the UK from history books, and it's Great Britain is painted as the biggest enemy of Spain, and so maybe there was.
We had France as well.
Yeah, no, but I think there was like a strongest feeling of animosity against Britain. That's the name of the book of Paul Preston. I can't remember right now, but it's this adjective that was put to Britain all the time in the Spanish. Perfidious Albion. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, really, in a sense, everything you've said, in a sense, helps me to explain what's happening, because the fact that people in Britain knew so little about Spain meant it was the perfect place to go and imagine you know, this sort of country didn't, you know, there's the one country in Europe really that it's in the western part of Europe where people didn't know very much, and it helped them to create kind of almost a fantasy world, you know, in which I think you want to justify this being a struggle between good and evil, light and dark, and so on. So I think probably that actually does help.
We had a different fantasy about Greece.
Ah, yeah.
But because of that lack of knowledge, also the power of visual
Yeah,
media
yeah.
is very important in giving people, kind of mobilizing emotions around imagine Spain. That, you know, that those newspaper photographs, issues of famine, atrocities, etc., became a very important role, I think, for a country that doesn't know very much. Okay, two last questions, Paul, and I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Alex, Paul and Alex, please. Yeah.
I wanted to just endorse the general theme about Spain, this crisis being pivotal. I mean, I felt it very personally. I was here in the 70s and politically very active on many demonstrations, and we were demonstrating, you know, with Greece and Portugal, which subsequently fell, and then with Spain. But there was a kind of romance about what had happened in the 30s. I mean, obviously fueled by Homage to Catalonia, which everyone read and had well thumbed copies. But I was thinking of, you know, at the time, I had friends who live in Cable Street. They still live in Cable Street. So that battle against fascism in 36 was incredibly current in thinking. You talked about the 38 by-election year. I think that was you know, very kind of influential. And then the Munich 1940, and then we talked about the Oxfam thing, which, like many others, I wanted to bring up as well. But I think it just seems so redundant, doesn't it? So I kind of feel that this is about the romance of it. It is about the value principles, and probably less about Spain in itself, but also the fact that it was a loss. We always romanticize about a loss. My question was really to switch it a little bit and say there's been a lot of work on thinking about the civil war in Spain in the last decades, and it's going back. And I wondered whether you had any kind of thoughts about how Spanish people view the contribution that came from Britain in terms of support in places like Oxford. I mean, does it colour the kind of views that Spanish people might have towards Britain, towards particular cities, towards particular initiatives, and so on? Yeah.
Let's hold up for a second, combine the last three. I realize it's quite late. So Alex, why don't you go right to your question?
Okay, thanks very much indeed. I was fascinated by everything that you said, but one of the things I couldn't help thinking about was picked up by Tom actually in his comments. It's very, very Oxford-centric, but nonetheless appropriately so. It's the 38 election. And one has heard about this on and off over the years many, many times. So one kind of got thoughts and then forgets things. If I remember correctly, Louis MacNeice has a poem about coming to campaign for Lindsay. So it's kind of all the kind of nice people did, as it were. And so you'll then end up worrying, well, why did Hogg still win it? And it would have been important enough to have got a lot of coverage in the national press. So there is a coverage of how the national press is handling it, just as much as the local press, I would have thought. And the students, and many of the students are not going to be old enough to vote, so it's going to be middle-aged Doms and stuff in a university-only election. So if it had been an Oxford town election, it might have been a completely different result, and more like the Bridgewater. Right.
This was the Oxford.
Was university or was it town?
The town.
It was town.
It was town,
Yeah.
wasn't it?
Yeah, I think the Oxford University one was.
Oh, okay. Right. That was okay. Right. Okay. In that case, it can't be explained the way I'm thinking it explained. So that's a key fact. So it shows what one loses over the passage of time. The other thing I couldn't help noticing was the union bill that you put up with the union motion Quintin Hogg was then followed by C.N. Joad. It wasn't obvious from that whether Joad was speaking on the same side as Hogg was against him. I imagine against, because I think the union will list it as one side, the other side, one side, the other side, which is, if that isn't correct, then there's a Balliol split, because Joad is also a Balliol. So one would imagine he's speaking on the same side as Lindsay. And he became a legendary figure, Joad, for the population.
It does happen. We had Heath against Jenkins.
Yes, that's true, but for a slightly more peaceful election, possibly. Maybe not of quite world significance either, but no, I remember that too. And I had another very, very good point, but given that it was a town election rather than US elections, I've just discovered is actually completely irrelevant. So that will do.
Great, thank you. Julie, that's fine.
Thank you. I know it was a wonderful presentation and very, very interesting because of the Oxford connection. I'm just curious as to whether you've been to see the Oxford Spanish War Memorial.
Oh yes.
Oh, you have.
Yeah,
with
yeah.
the wonderful what's it called, by C.J. Lewis.
Yes, I think so.
We came because our open eyes could see no other way.
Yeah, and
It's
that's
so beautiful.
and that's the title of the book on Oxford and the reaction to the Spanish Civil War. The main work, no other way, because of that point.
No other way. Yes.
Yeah, yeah, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. I saw it by accident going to a playground at South Park, and I saw it and I was delighted. So, well, going back to the questions, what was the Spanish people view of the UK during the of this help they were receiving? Well, I know that official propaganda was selling it as a proof and as evidence that Spain had many friends, Republican Spain had many friends, that they had, in fact, the international public opinion behind them. And it was this black hand behind the matters that had made their governments agree with the non-intervention policy. But I don't really know how the common citizens felt about these health schemes. What I know is that the black bad view of the British as the enemies of the Spanish of Spain was omnipresent in people's views, in the ordinary citizen mindset. So I don't know if these help they were receiving did something to alleviate this bad image Spanish people had of the British. I know that Franco took the opportunity that this was an omnipresent mindset in the Spanish population to try to justify its international isolation in the post-war era and try to say that Britain was in fact this perfidious Albion, again hurting Spain internationally. So my guess is that probably this help didn't do much to help the public image of the British people between Spanish citizens. But I'm not completely sure. And thank you, Alex, for your comments. What I can say about this is that this by-election got not only national but also international attention because many other countries commented on it. Being all of them focusing their attention into this international situation, the non-intervention policy, and overall this fight between democracy and the dictatorships. They saw this election as part of all these phenomena, so they put attention to that. And the Lindsay campaigners commented that Hitler was following the election and the polls and what happened after Lindsay lost the election very closely. So it had even an international impact.
Julia.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And I guess one of the unique features of the Spanish Civil War is it's at once a civil war, international war, and becomes a kind of template. Unfortunately, for kind of 20th century politics of violence, so that it kind of sets a certain kind of frame in motion, for the next 100 years or so. Okay, thank you very much. That's a wonderful presentation. It was really hugely interesting. You've really made great use already of your Oxford time, and you have more to come. So I'm very, very pleased with that. Thank you very, very much, Tom, for such an excellent and well-informed comment. Thank you all for coming. Next week we're going to be looking at the history of higher education. Sonia Giebel will be giving her presentation. So I hope to see you all next week, and thanks again.